She had no idea what her backyard was hiding, but once she dug up the ground, an entrance sealed for decades appeared before her. What happened next is something no one will ever forget. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Miriam had imagined this moment so many times that it felt almost unreal when the last cardboard box was pushed through the doorway of the house she had fought for with every scrap of strength she possessed. The quiet street, the distant sound of the ocean, the pale sunlight breaking across the windows like a promise. Everything should have felt like a victory. Yet, as she stood in the dim hallway, the air tasting faintly of dust and old wood, she felt something much heavier pressing on her chest. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the weight of a long life of disappointments, failures, and days spent forcing herself to move forward when all she wanted was to collapse. Buying this house was supposed to be the start of something else, something better, something she had earned. But now that she was here, her hands trembling on the edges of her last moving box, she wondered if she even remembered how it felt to simply live without waiting for the next blow. Her past had been a long corridor of rooms she would rather never revisit. Childhood in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than holidays. Years spent watching her mother wash other people's clothes for small wages. Dreams that shriveled early because every path forward seemed blocked by money she didn't have or opportunities that belonged to someone else. Later came marriage, a mistake disguised as salvation. Her husband's charm had evaporated quickly, replaced by cutting reminders of who held the money, who made decisions, who she should be grateful to. Miriam learned to shrink, to apologize for things that were not her fault, to stretch every dollar thinner than skin. Eventually, as debts grew and her husband's temper worsened, she understood that the only thing more dangerous than leaving him was staying with him. She walked away with almost nothing, except a piece of herself she had thought was gone forever, the part that still believed she deserved something better. The years that followed had been an exhausting battle for financial stability. She took every shift she could, every extra weekend, every second job. She cleaned offices at night, helped elderly patients in a small clinic by day, waited tables in the evenings. Little by little, she saved. She denied herself vacations, new clothes, social outings. She didn't drink coffee from cafes like others. Every dollar went toward the dream her mother had whispered into her heart long ago, a home of her own, one that belonged only to her, one no one could take away. That dream had finally materialized in the form of this modest house near the coast. On paper, it was nothing special. A small structure built decades ago, with weathered shingles and a garden overgrown with stubborn coastal plants that refused to die even through the harsh winds. Yet, when Miriam first stepped inside during the viewing, she felt an inexplicable pull. It was quiet, solid, as though waiting. The real estate agent had seemed eager, too eager to close the deal, brushing off her questions with a thin smile and an insistence that the house was perfectly ordinary. Miriam, exhausted by years of searching and rejection, chose not to push further. The price was low for the area, low enough to make her suspicious, but also low enough to allow her to finally claim something of her own. She convinced herself that sometimes good fortune came disguised as bargains, not as traps. During the first night she slept in the house, it felt like the structure itself was listening. Every board creaked in a way that sounded intentional, as if acknowledging the presence of someone new. Wind pushed against the windows with a gentle persistence, and the distant boom of waves against the shore echoed through the walls. Miriam lay awake thinking about her mother. She imagined her smiling, proud, murmuring, You did it, baby. You finally did it." That thought carried her into the earliest hours of the morning. But morning light revealed something else. The house felt too still, the kind of stillness that didn't come from peace, but from being closed up too long, untouched, unsmiling. There was no warmth of previous owners lingering in the corners, no faint scent of someone's favorite perfume, no hint of laughter or life. It felt as if the house had been holding its breath for years. During her second day of unpacking, Miriam walked into the small storage room near the back of the house. It was barely more than a closet, with faded wallpaper peeling in the corners and a small window that didn't open. A heavy old cupboard stood strangely out of place there, as if someone had dragged it into the room recently rather than leaving it naturally over time. When Miriam stepped across the floor, something in the boards beneath her feet echoed in a way that felt hollow. She paused, stepping again. The sound repeated, deeper than the normal thud of wood on frame. It was a low, muted thump, like tapping on a drum. She crouched, placing her palm flat on the floor. The boards there felt different, cooler, as if they covered something not connected to the rest of the foundation. She frowned, standing slowly as her mind began to spin. Houses creaked, houses aged, but hollow floors were something else entirely. For the next few hours, she convinced herself it was nothing. Maybe a vent, maybe old construction quirks, maybe uneven soil under the house. Her mind reached for explanations the way a frightened child reaches for a blanket. But by evening, the thought gnawed at her too persistently to ignore. The next morning, Miriam returned to the storage room. This time, she was determined to figure out why that small section of floor sounded wrong. She moved the cupboard aside, surprised at how difficult it was to slide, almost as if it had been placed specifically to cover one spot. Beneath it, the carpet looked newer than the rest of the room, and when she pulled it back, she saw a rectangular outline in the floorboards, faint but definite, as though someone had replaced several planks in a hurry. The nails on that section were newer, shinier than the rest. Her pulse rose. She knelt and pressed her fingers along the edges of the newer boards. One had a corner slightly raised. She took a screwdriver from her toolbox and pried gently. The board lifted with surprising ease, revealing a dark patch of worn metal beneath it. For a moment, Miriam froze. Metal floors under wooden houses were not normal. Metal meant something else was there, something intentionally hidden. Taking a deep breath, she removed more of the boards, each one revealing more of the metallic surface. Dust rose in faint clouds. When she had cleared the square entirely, she saw that it was not just a metal sheet, it was a hatch. A heavy, old, industrial-looking hatch embedded beneath the wooden floor, its hinges rusted, its handle thick and cold. The sight made her skin prickle. Someone had gone to significant lengths to hide this. Someone had nailed fresh boards, placed carpet, positioned furniture with precision. The idea that the previous owners might have known about it, might have deliberately concealed it, sent a chill along Miriam's spine. She sat back on her heels, staring at the hatch with a mixture of dread and curiosity. Part of her wanted to close everything, push the boards back over it, forget she had stumbled upon this secret. After all, she had just begun her life anew. The last thing she needed was a problem buried beneath the house. But another part of her, the part shaped by hardship and perseverance, whispered that ignoring the unknown had never saved anyone. Problems did not disappear when covered. They festered. As evening fell and the shadows stretched long across the room, Miriam gathered her courage. She stood over the hatch, wiped dust from the metal with her sleeve, and wrapped her fingers around the handle. The metal was colder than expected. It felt almost alive beneath her grip. She pulled. At first, it resisted, as if the weight of years kept it sealed, but with enough force the hinges let out a deep, agonizing creak. A gust of cold, stale air rose from the opening, carrying the scent of rust, damp stone, and something older, something untouched by light for longer than she could imagine. Miriam aimed her flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the dust and revealed a vertical shaft lined with thick concrete. A rusty ladder clung to the wall, its length descending far beyond what the flashlight could illuminate. She leaned closer, shining the beam downward, but the bottom remained hidden in darkness. The air rising from below was startlingly cold, as though preserved. Her heart pounded. She imagined every horror that could possibly be beneath her. Animals, abandoned rooms, collapsed tunnels, remnants of lives she did not understand. But she also imagined her mother's voice telling her that strength lay not in running, but in understanding. The house was hers now. Whatever lay beneath it was also hers. She exhaled slowly, letting fear settle into something sharper, more controlled. She would return, she promised herself. She would prepare, gather supplies, and descend to see what this house, her house, had been hiding. For now, though, she gently lowered the hatch, sealing the darkness below. But even as the metal clanged shut and silence returned to the small storage room, Miriam knew her life had already changed. The house she had longed for, fought for, dreamed of, was not simply a home. It was a doorway into something that had been buried, perhaps deliberately, for reasons she could not yet guess. And as she walked away from the hatch that night, she felt the weight of the unknown pressing upward from beneath her feet, patient and waiting. For the rest of that night, Miriam lay awake listening to the wind scrape along the windows and the distant rumble of the ocean. But beneath those natural sounds, something else lingered in her mind, something quieter but far more persistent. The idea of the hatch beneath her floor, cold and metallic, waiting. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the darkness yawning below it, the ladder disappearing into a void that seemed deeper than anything a simple house should contain. The more she tried to push the thought away, the stronger it returned until it felt like a pulse beneath the floorboards, an insistent whisper beneath her thoughts. When daylight finally spilled into her bedroom, its warmth did nothing to ease her unsettled feeling. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around the mug as if the heat could anchor her. The hatch was still there. The mystery was still there. And as much as she wanted to be someone who could simply ignore it, pretend the boards hid nothing but a harmless crawl space, she knew she was not that person. Not anymore. Her whole life had been shaped by things she tried to ignore until they finally exploded around her. She refused to make that mistake again. So she set about preparing. She did not rush. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though the very pace of her actions could steady her heart. She found an old backpack from her years of working double shifts and packed it with a flashlight far stronger than the one she'd used the night before. Another smaller one as backup, a length of rope, gloves, a dust mask, a notebook, 2 bottles of water, and her phone. The phone felt almost useless. She doubted there would be any signal down there, but she brought it anyway, a fragile lifeline to the surface. By the time she returned to the storage room, morning light had fully brightened the space, giving it a clarity that had been missing the night before. The hatch looked less menacing under the glow of day, but not entirely harmless. Its cold metal still seemed to carry secrets that the sun could not warm. She opened it again, this time expecting the stale breath of air that rose from below. The ladder clung to the concrete wall like a spine, rusted and rigid. She tested one of the rungs with her weight from above. It groaned but held. Her second test confirmed it was not about to detach completely. Still, she wrapped the rope around her waist and tied the other end securely to the leg of the heavy cupboard she'd moved aside, doubling the knot until she was sure it would not slip. When she finally stepped onto the ladder and lowered herself into the shaft, the world above her shrank with every rung. The sunlight dimmed. The soft sounds of the house disappeared, replaced by the close echoing of her breaths, the faint rattle of old metal beneath her feet, and the oppressive silence of a place untouched. The air grew colder the deeper she descended, wrapping around her arms and legs like invisible fingers. She tried to steady her breathing, focusing only on one rung at a time. The descent felt longer than she anticipated. At one point, she paused, shining her flashlight upward. The opening above had become small, distant, almost unreal, like a window into a life she had stepped out of. When, at last, her foot touched the floor, she exhaled in relief, though the sound echoed strangely in the chamber. The space she'd entered was narrow, not much wider than the shaft itself. The ceiling was low, dripping with condensation. She directed her flashlight forward and saw a corridor stretching into darkness, its walls smooth concrete reinforced with steel, its ceiling lined with old wiring and pipes that hinted at once functional machinery. Her shoes pressed into layers of dust that responded like powder, leaving visible footprints behind her. She took a few steps, letting her eyes adjust to the strange space. The air smelled of rust and old machinery, tinged with something else, something faintly metallic and stale, the scent of a place sealed off from the world for decades. The corridor seemed to press inward with silent expectation. She felt as though she were trespassing on something meant to remain undisturbed. Yet, curiosity tugged her forward. She walked slowly, placing her feet carefully so that each step made only a soft crunching sound. Light flickered across the walls as her flashlight moved. She noticed old markings, letters stenciled in white paint, faded past clarity. Numbers. Arrows pointing to destinations she could not yet see. Someone had planned this place with precision. It was not merely a basement or bomb shelter. It was something larger, something built for coordinated activity. The corridor eventually widened into a more pronounced space where she saw the shape of a massive steel door looming ahead. The door was thick, reinforced with crossbars and bolts large enough to withstand blasts. She approached cautiously, reaching out to run her fingers along the cool surface. Even through her gloves, the cold felt intense, as if the metal retained the memory of a deeper chill. On the door, barely visible beneath grime and age, was a faded insignia. She traced the shape, unsure of its meaning, but recognizing that it was military in nature. She pushed the door. At first, it did not move. She leaned harder, putting her shoulder into it. The hinges screeched long and agonizing, protesting as if waking from a sleep far too deep. After another push, the door gave way, swinging inward with a heavy groan that echoed down the unseen corridors beyond. Her flashlight revealed a wide room that made her freeze where she stood. It was like stepping into a photograph of another life, frozen in time. Rows of desks, each with old radio equipment or telephones, lined the walls. Maps hung crookedly, yellowed with age. Filing cabinets filled with papers stood against one wall, their drawers slightly ajar. Dust coated everything, thick as ash. She moved slowly, feeling like an intruder in a place meant to be sealed forever. Every object she passed told a story. A metal cup left beside a chair, a pair of reading glasses resting on a table, a stack of handwritten reports tied together with brittle string. Nothing looked disturbed. No sign of collapse or vandalism. It was as if the people working here had simply stood up and walked away, leaving this underground world locked behind them. At the far end of the room was another doorway leading to a narrow hallway. As she followed it, she found sleeping quarters, rows of small metal beds, some still made with blankets that had faded into indistinct shades of brown. Personal belongings lay on small metal trays beside the beds. Photographs of families, dog tags, playing cards, watches, folded handkerchiefs. Miriam picked up one of the photographs, brushing dust off its surface. A man in uniform stood smiling with two children at his side. Their faces seemed too alive to belong to something so forgotten. She continued exploring. A storage room held sealed crates stacked waist-high, some stenciled with faded labels. Food supplies, medical kits, equipment of various kinds. A faint shiver passed over her when she realized many crates had not been touched since the 1940s. In the air there lingered something electric, not in the literal sense, but the sensation of standing inside history itself. The walls around her felt heavy with decades of silence. She ventured deeper, reaching a room filled with communication equipment. Radios, telephones, switches and dials, wires that ran like veins across the walls. On a large table lay maps marked with arrows and circles, lines drawn in different colors, coordinates scribbled in the margins. She didn't recognize the specifics, but she understood enough to know this was no simple bunker. This had been a command center, a place of strategy and vigilance. The thought tightened her chest. Why was this here? Why was it forgotten? And who had sealed it away so carefully that no one knew it existed anymore? Her mind drifted back to the hidden hatch, the way the floorboards had been replaced, the way the cupboard had been positioned. Someone had wanted this place to disappear. Not temporarily, but permanently. She imagined the previous owners of the house. An elderly couple, according to the realtor. What had they known? Why hadn't they mentioned a bunker beneath the property? Had they been afraid? Or were they protecting something? As she moved through the complex, Miriam began to sense that the secrecy here ran deeper than she could yet understand. It was not just neglect or abandonment. There was intention, decisions made, actions taken, burials both literal and metaphorical. But the more she saw, the more she felt something else rising within her, a sense of connection. These rooms had held people who lived underground, breathing recycled air, eating canned meals, reading letters from home. They had laughed here, feared here, waited out nights of war. Their lives had been reduced to dust and silence, sealed beneath a house that now belonged to her. She felt a strange responsibility settling onto her shoulders, a weight different from her past burdens. This one did not crush, it called. When she finally turned back toward the ladder hours later, exhausted but trembling with new awareness, she felt changed. She knew she would return. She knew she had stepped into something far greater than a hidden basement. And she knew, even before her feet touched the upper floor, that the secret living in the depths below had only begun to reveal itself. As she closed the hatch once more, the old hinges moaned, sealing the darkness beneath her. But this time, she did not feel fear. She felt purpose. For the next several days, Miriam moved through her home with the quiet awareness of someone who knew she was living above another world. She cooked, cleaned, unpacked the last of her boxes, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. Yet every sound in the house reminded her of the hollow space beneath her feet. The memory of the thick steel door, the rows of abandoned beds, the photographs of men who had once lived underground pressed into her mind like fingerprints she could not wipe away. She found herself waking at odd hours, hearing echoes she knew were not real, seeing a flash of uniformed shadows at the edges of her imagination. The bunker had not frightened her. It had unsettled her in a deeper, more permanent way. It demanded answers, and she could not pretend she didn't feel that demand growing stronger each day. On the morning she resolved to return, a strange calm settled over her. It was not bravery, not exactly, but a decision to stop hesitating, to stop circling the hatch like a frightened animal. This discovery was part of her now, and she had never been the kind of woman who backed away from something simply because it was difficult. She gathered her gear again, this time with more intention. The notebook she brought was blank, waiting to be filled with whatever she would uncover. The flashlight felt steadier in her hand. She had slept little, but her focus was sharp. When she opened the hatch once more, the breath of cold air rising from below felt familiar, almost welcoming. Descending the ladder a second time was easier. The creak of metal no longer startled her. Her muscles remembered the rhythm of the descent, and soon her feet touched the concrete floor with confidence. The dust still lay thick, undisturbed except for her previous footsteps, which now looked like faint, ghostly tracks in the dim beam of her flashlight. This time, she did not linger in the first rooms. She moved with clearer purpose, retracing the path she'd walked before. The communications center, the sleeping quarters, the storage rooms, all of them felt slightly different now, not because they had changed, but because she had. Before, she had been a stunned explorer stumbling through a forgotten world. Now, she was a seeker of truth. She made her way to the room with the filing cabinets. Tugging open the first drawer took effort, the metal squealing as though resisting her attempt to disturb the past. Inside were folders thick with papers brittle from decades of stillness. She pulled several out gently, laying them across a table, and began reading. The handwriting was precise. The ink faded to a muted gray. Many of the documents were routine reports about supply shipments, personnel rotations, equipment maintenance. But scattered among them were pages marked with more urgency. Radio intercepts, coded messages, references to unidentified vessels offshore. Some mentioned increased surveillance along the coastline during periods of heightened wartime tension. All of them suggested that this place had been part of something larger than a standard military outpost. As she read, she noticed that certain pages had small holes punched in the corners, as if they had once been bound into a classified notebook or secured with fasteners. Others showed signs of having been hastily removed, edges torn, staples bent, ink smeared. At first, she assumed it was simple deterioration, but the more she examined them, the clearer it became that someone had removed information intentionally. Entire sequences of pages were missing from folders, gaps that made no sense unless someone had come through after the bunker was abandoned and taken what they wanted. That thought made her pause, standing in the cold, shadow-filled room with the papers in hand. Someone had been here after the war. Someone with access and knowledge. The idea that the bunker had not simply been forgotten but actively concealed settled uneasily into her chest. The hatch in her house had not just been covered with boards, It had been disguised, and disguise was not the same as decay. The more she looked, the more she found. In the next room, she discovered notebooks that seemed like personal journals written by the men stationed underground. The handwriting varied from neat, controlled script to messy scrawl created by tired or frustrated hands. She flipped through one and found entries describing long nights waiting for potential enemy submarines, mentions of coded orders from higher authorities, worries about the war's progress, complaints about the isolation. One entry in particular caught her eye, not because it was dramatic, but because of its tone. It was from a soldier who wrote that the officers had sealed off one section of the bunker after certain developments, and had told the lower ranks it was for security. The writer had suspected they were hiding something but had no idea what. She closed the journal slowly, letting those words settle in her mind like sediment. Sections sealed off, certain developments, orders that seemed to come from nowhere. These details were not simply relics of wartime paranoia. They were clues. In the corridor outside, she paused to study the walls more closely. With her flashlight angled just right, she noticed subtle differences in texture along portions of the concrete. Some sections looked smoother, newer, with slightly different coloration as if patched over years after the original construction. She ran her fingertips over the surface, feeling transitions between old and newer material. The fact that part of the bunker had been altered after its original use was undeniable. She moved to a section where the corridor branched off and found another sealed door, not as massive as the main one she had opened earlier, but still substantial. The hinges were welded shut, the metal coated in a dusty film. Leaning close, she saw that the welding was newer than the rest of the bunker. Whoever had done this had used more modern tools from decades after the war. The welds were uneven, rushed, as if the person doing the job wanted it done quickly without caring about craftsmanship. Standing there, with her flashlight illuminating the sloppy metalwork, a chill ran through her. This was not the work of wartime engineers. This was someone hiding something long after the bunker was abandoned. A faint vibration traveled through the concrete at her feet, as if the world above reminded her that she was far from the safety of an ordinary life. The silence pressed in around her until she forced herself to breathe deeply and regain her composure. She followed the corridor into another room where she had noticed wiring the last time she was here. The wires running across the ceiling were mostly old, cloth-insulated, cracked, or frayed. But in one corner of the room, she spotted a section that was different. Newer rubber insulation, wrapped in a style that clearly did not belong to the 1940s. Someone had cut into the old wiring and spliced modern material over it. The contrast was striking. Decades-old dust covered everything but the splice, as if the work had been done far more recently than the age of the bunker itself. Her pulse quickened. Someone had not only sealed doors, they had tampered with the infrastructure. Walking deeper into the corridor system, she found a large ventilation shaft. Most of the vents were rusted and filled with debris, but one had been covered with a newer metal grate. It appeared out of place, the screws shiny compared to the corroded ones nearby. She knelt to examine them more closely and saw that 2 screws had faint marks on them, as if someone had loosened and retightened them. She tried to pull the grate, but it held firm. The metal was far newer than anything else in the bunker. The realization came slowly, then with the weight of a sudden blow. Someone had been down here in more recent years. Someone had taken steps to block certain passages, control airflow, conceal old sections. Someone had deliberately hidden much of this bunker from the surface world. A jolt of unease shot through her. She had assumed the bunker was a relic of forgotten history, a sealed tomb left untouched for decades. But now she was not so sure that she was the first person to uncover it. She wondered whether someone else had come down the same ladder, walked the same corridors, made decisions about what should remain hidden. Had they died, moved away, abandoned their efforts, or were they still out there, fully aware that the bunker existed and now likely aware that someone else had discovered it? Her steps slowed as she returned toward the central rooms. She needed help, someone who understood construction, structure, and the clues she was finding, someone who could tell her which alterations were original and which were not. There was only one person she trusted even a little in her new neighborhood, the older man next door who owned a small construction company. She hesitated at the ladder, but eventually climbed up, feeling the cold walls brushing her sides as she ascended. When she emerged into her storage room and closed the hatch behind her, the house seemed impossibly warm. The smell of clean wood, the soft glow of sunlight through the window, the ordinary carpet beneath her feet. All of it contrasted painfully with the darkness below. Later that afternoon, she walked to her neighbor's house. He listened as she explained things carefully, trying not to sound unhinged. She described the concrete chambers beneath her home, the equipment, the welded doors, the newer structural patches. His face shifted from mild curiosity to deep concern, and then to professional focus. He asked to see it himself. The moment he climbed down the ladder, Miriam knew she had done the right thing. His flashlight moved across the walls with practiced expertise, his eyes scanning every inch. His questions were sharp and practical. The more he explored, the more serious he became. He eventually told her in a quiet voice that the bunker was not only real, it was built with extremely high-quality wartime engineering, far more complex than anything a simple coastal town would have required. He confirmed that much of the concrete had been patched decades later, and several corridors appeared intentionally blocked. When they returned to the surface, he stood silently for a long moment before saying that whatever she had found was not trivial. He suggested they examine more of the underground structure, but carefully, without alerting authorities just yet. He mentioned that certain historical sites were sometimes seized by the government or by private collectors if discovered. Miriam's stomach tightened at the idea of losing her home, her sanctuary, over a place she hadn't even asked for. She decided they would proceed cautiously. That night, lying in bed, she thought not of fear, but of inevitability. The bunker had been waiting for someone to find it again, and for reasons she could not yet name, that someone had become her. The truth, hidden in those sealed rooms, would not remain buried forever. And she sensed, with a certainty that chilled her, that the deeper she dug into the bunker's past, the more she would dig into people's intentions, people who might not want to be discovered. The house creaked gently in the darkness. The ocean whispered beyond the dunes, and beneath her the silent rooms waited with truths she could not yet fathom. The days that followed took on an unusual rhythm, as though Miriam were living two lives at once. Above ground, she was the new homeowner, quietly tending to her yard, occasionally chatting with passing neighbors, learning the patterns of a town that still felt foreign to her. But beneath her house, hidden from all but the handful of people she trusted, stretched a world built in shadow and silence, a relic of men who had once watched the sea with vigilance and secrets in their hearts. The more she explored the bunker with her neighbor's help, the more she sensed that this was not merely an abandoned military structure, but a fragment of a story deliberately removed from history. Her neighbor, whose name was Henry, brought tools, flashlights, and old construction experience accumulated across decades. He had a steady presence that eased the tension she hadn't realized she carried in her shoulders. Together, they mapped sections of the bunker, noting which walls seemed original and which had been tampered with years later. But each time they thought they had grasped the limits of the structure, they found another corridor, another unexpected turn, another suggestion that the bunker extended farther than any of them could initially imagine. On the morning, they discovered the trace that would lead them to the observation tower. The air carried the heavy scent of approaching rain. Clouds gathered low and thick, dimming the daylight that filtered into her home. They descended the ladder with practiced ease, each step down feeling less like intruding and more like entering a strange second residence. Henry carried a small portable generator that allowed them to set up temporary lighting in some of the larger rooms they frequently examined. The soft hum it produced echoed like a heartbeat in the quiet bunker. Their focus that day turned toward a corridor that branched off near one of the older sleeping quarters. Miriam had noticed on her first exploration that the corridor seemed to slope slightly downward, and the concrete along its edges was damp, as though moisture from the outside earth had slowly seeped in. The ceiling here was lower, the temperature colder, and something about the corridor's shape felt unnatural, as if it were never meant to be part of the original design. They followed it carefully, shining flashlights along the walls. The corridor bent left, then right, narrowing until it ended abruptly in a wall of earth. Henry examined it, kneeling and pushing aside loose dirt with a gloved hand. He pressed on a section of soil, and it shifted slightly, revealing a hard surface beneath. Concrete. Reinforced and covered deliberately, but eroded just enough by time for a persistent hand to find purchase. The realization startled them both. This was not a collapsed tunnel. This was a buried one. Henry's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and cautious. Someone had filled this passage intentionally. The soil composition was different from the natural earth around them, packed tightly and showing signs of having been shoveled in manually. Miriam stared at the wall, an unnerving sense of conspiracy tightening in her chest. The more they worked on uncovering the surface, the clearer it became that beneath the layer of earth lay a metal hatch or door embedded in the floor or side wall of the corridor, something meant to be hidden. They did not dig too far on the first day. The risk of collapse was too great without proper tools and reinforcement. Henry promised to return with sturdier equipment, but even before they left, Miriam sensed that the sealed passage led to something crucial, something buried deeper than the rest of the bunker. The next day, under a sky washed clean by rain, Henry brought a small crew of 2 trusted workers, men he'd known for years who knew how to keep quiet. They were told only that Miriam had discovered an old structure under her house that needed careful excavation and safety reinforcement. No one asked questions they didn't need answers to. Miriam felt grateful for that discretion. They spent hours digging, clearing soil from the concrete and metal until the structure beneath revealed itself more fully, a rounded metal top with a central pivot point, like the crown of an old silo or reinforced dome. It was weathered but unmistakably designed to withstand pressure. As more soil was cleared, a narrow hatch became visible, bolted shut from the inside decades ago. The moment Henry pried it open, a draft of deep, stale air pushed upward, thick with the scent of metal that had not tasted air in a generation. Flashlights probed into the opening, revealing a ladder descending at a steep angle. It was similar to the one beneath Miriam's house, but broader and sturdier, built to support heavier traffic. Miriam's pulse raced. She knew instinctively that this ladder led to something significant. One by one, they climbed down. The air was colder here, drier. The ladder descended into a narrow cylindrical chamber, and at its base they found a heavy steel door partially ajar, its hinges stiff with age. They pushed it open with effort, revealing a space that made Miriam's breath catch. It was a circular room with thick, reinforced walls curving upward into a dome. On the outer edge of the wall were narrow vertical slits covered by metal shutters controlled by levers. Near the center of the room were fixed mounts for instruments she didn't recognize at first, until she saw the scopes. Long, high-powered optical devices extended toward the slitted openings like metallic limbs. Some were mounted on adjustable pedestals, others on rail systems that allowed them to be moved horizontally. Tables nearby were covered in dust and scattered with yellowed papers, some still bearing faint outlines of maps showing coastal lines and marked points along the sea. It was an observation tower, not a lookout meant for tourists or peaceful weather charts. This was a military observation post, hidden deep beneath the surface, and its watchful eyes once trained on the ocean, scanning for threats. Miriam ran her hand across the cold metal of one of the scopes, imagining men standing here, peering through the slit at the distant horizon, ready to signal alarms if anything suspicious appeared offshore. Henry's crew wandered the room quietly, awed by its preservation. The equipment, though lifeless now, had somehow survived decades underground with minimal corrosion. The controlled environment of the sealed tower had kept rust at bay and prevented decay. Everything here looked poised to awaken with just the flick of a switch, if only the power still ran. Miriam approached a small stack of documents on one of the tables. The top sheet had a date printed near the upper corner, 1944. The handwriting beneath it was a summary of observed movements offshore, likely coded messages or enemy vessel sightings. Another paper had a detailed sketch of a coastline section with cryptic notations. Each document added another layer to the growing puzzle. Not only had this bunker and its observation tower played an active role during the war, but they had done so with a secrecy that went far beyond standard operations. She could feel the importance swelling inside her like a tide. This was no decaying ruin. This was a preserved time capsule, one that held stories deliberately removed from the public eye. But why? And by whom? While she sorted through the documents, Henry circled the room, examining structural elements with a furrowed brow. He pointed out that the dome had been engineered with extraordinary precision, its walls shaped to absorb shock waves. He speculated that the tower had been designed to survive near-miss bombings or ground tremors. When he traced his hand along a crack visible near the far wall, he noted that the damage was old, likely from an earthquake decades ago, but the crack had never widened. The tower's integrity impressed him. They ventured into a smaller adjoining room accessible through a short passage. Inside, they found control panels with analog dials and thick cables running into the walls. Shelves lined with binoculars, spare lenses, and maintenance tools stood undisturbed. The air here felt heavier, as if steeped in the ghosts of activity once humming through the space. Documents on a central table included wartime photographs showing aerial views of the coastline and diagrams of submarine detection systems. Miriam felt a chill run down her spine as she turned one page and found a list of names with roles assigned beside them. Some were listed as observers, others as communications officers. One entry noted a shift rotation during a period of heightened alert. The last date recorded before the list abruptly stopped was late 1945. She wondered where these men had gone when the war ended. Had they been reassigned? Had they left willingly? Or had they been ordered to abandon the tower without explanation? As she stood in the dim glow of her flashlight, the air silent except for faint murmurs from Henry's crew in the next chamber, she felt an overwhelming sense of stepping directly into the past, as if the walls might suddenly echo with forgotten voices or footsteps. It was intoxicating and unnerving all at once. But the discovery of the tower came with a new burden. The more they unearthed, the more it became evident that the entire structure had been intentionally buried. Layers of soil had been packed over the dome, likely after the war. Someone had wanted this lookout point erased, as if it had never existed. That realization brought with it a sharp pang of fear. Who had done this? And were they still alive or influential enough to care that she was now peeling back the layers of their long-concealed past? The following days brought further revelations. They worked to clear more of the tower's exterior, carefully brushing away earth to reveal the architectural design. At times, the work felt almost archaeological, like uncovering the ruins of some ancient civilization rather than a mid-century military installation. Miriam noticed that Henry became more cautious as they progressed. He spoke quietly about the implications. The level of engineering, the extent of the complex, the deliberate burial. It all pointed to something far more significant than a forgotten wartime outpost. One afternoon, as they were clearing the last stretch of soil near the tower entrance, Miriam stood back and looked toward the dunes that bordered her property. For the first time, she noticed something she had previously dismissed as natural landscaping, a slight, unnatural rise in the terrain forming a gentle curve. It aligned perfectly with the position of the tower beneath it. That small knoll had always struck her as an ordinary feature, but now it looked intentional. She could picture it decades ago, a soldier or engineer standing where she stood, overseeing the burial, ensuring no trace of the structure remained visible. The thought unsettled her deeply. It also connected to another observation she'd made over recent weeks, the sudden appearance of strangers driving slowly past her home. The way some people watched her property with a little too much interest. The way gossip in town had begun to swirl around her presence, though none of it outright hostile. Just curious. But there was a difference between curiosity and scrutiny, and Miriam feared she was drifting into the latter. That fear sharpened into something darker when she found a single boot print outside her fence one morning. The soil was soft from rain, the print crisp and unmistakable. Not Henry's, not one of the workers. Someone had stood there, watching, close enough to see her coming and going. She tried not to let the unease swallow her, but it clung to her thoughts long after. Still, despite the growing tension, she continued working alongside Henry, driven by a sense of purpose stronger than fear. They cleared, documented, and reinforced the structure methodically. In the bunker proper, Henry installed temporary supports in areas where ceilings showed minor cracking. He ran cables to provide better lighting, and they created a makeshift map showing the known rooms and corridors. Miriam was especially drawn to the control room of the observation tower. She often found herself lingering there after the others had gone for the day, running her fingertips along the handles of the shutters, imagining the tower alive with motion. She pictured the world those soldiers had known, a world at war where danger might surface at any moment from the sea. She wondered what last message they had sent from here, whether they had known when the war was finally ending, whether they had celebrated or simply disappeared back into civilian life. The more she tried to piece together the fragments of their story, the more incomplete it felt. Too many gaps, too many questions without answers. She sensed that if she wanted to know the truth about who had buried the tower, she would have to uncover every corner of the bunker. And if the bunker had been deliberately altered, someone had to know more. Someone alive now. One evening, after Henry and his crew had left, Miriam remained for a moment beside the observation slits, staring toward the ocean. Through the narrow openings, she could see glimpses of shifting light. It struck her that the horizon had not changed in all these years. The sea those soldiers had once scanned for threats was the same sea before her now. It connected her to them, bridging time with the simple continuity of water meeting sky. The moment filled her with a sense of reverence and foreboding. Because if the sea remained the same, then so too might the forces that had once required such vigilance. She wondered whether any of those forces or their secrets had truly disappeared. As she closed the hatch to the tower and made her way back through the bunker toward the ladder to her home, she felt something that had eluded her for weeks. The knowledge that every answer she sought would only deepen the questions still buried. The truth beneath her home was vast, intertwined with lives, loyalties, and decisions that had never been spoken aloud. And she sensed, with a chill trailing down her spine, that whatever had been buried here had been meant to stay hidden, not rediscovered. But now that she had uncovered it, nothing would ever remain the same again. The deeper Miriam ventured into the labyrinth beneath her home, the more she felt that each chamber, each sealed door, each forgotten scrap of paper was shaping a destiny she had never imagined for herself. She had come to this quiet coastal town seeking a new life, a place to breathe after years of hardship and disappointment. She had wanted peace, stability, a sense of belonging. Yet, what she had found instead was a secret buried so profoundly into the earth that it seemed to anchor her in ways she could neither reject nor ignore. Every day that she and Henry unearthed more of the bunker's forgotten history, Miriam felt less like an accidental discoverer and more like a custodian of something immense. A place once dedicated to vigilance and secrecy was now under her responsibility, compelling her to decide how it should be brought back into the light. The idea of the museum began almost quietly, like a whisper threading itself through her thoughts whenever she lingered in the observation tower or sorted through stacks of wartime documents. It formed gradually, growing more substantial each time she realized how extraordinary the bunker truly was. This was not merely a relic, but a preserved fragment of humanity. Men who had watched the ocean with fear and hope, who had lived underground waiting for a threat that might never come. Their stories deserved to be known. The equipment deserved to be preserved. The silence deserved to be broken. One afternoon, she found herself standing in the middle of the largest chamber, looking at the radios, the maps, the bulletins, the carefully arranged bunks, and she felt an ache in her chest. The ache of knowing that history, when buried, was not only forgotten but erased. And erasure felt like a second death for the people who had once walked these corridors. The idea of turning the bunker into a museum no longer felt optional. It felt necessary, almost righteous. She wanted to honor the people who had served here, the engineers who built it, the voices recorded in the faded documents. She wanted to offer others the chance to understand what she had felt when she first stepped into the dim corridors, a shiver of awe mixed with sorrow. But with each step she took toward actualizing the idea, she sensed that she was walking into a complicated, unseen web. The discovery of the observation tower had already drawn uninvited attention. There had been the boot print by her fence, the unfamiliar cars driving by at odd hours, the sense that eyes she couldn't see were tracking her movements. Yet, even as unease wrapped itself around her like a fog, she clung to the belief that the truth mattered more than fear. Henry supported the idea wholeheartedly. He had a deep appreciation for history, born from a lifetime of building, repairing, and preserving structures others had long forgotten. He saw the bunker not only as an architectural marvel, but also as a vital piece of wartime reality that deserved preservation. His enthusiasm bolstered her, giving her the confidence to begin the long process of planning. They started with careful documentation. Miriam wrote notes in her notebook, filling page after page with observations, sketches, and ideas. Henry arranged spare lighting around their workspace so they could record and photograph everything. They talked about visitor routes, safety measures, and potential exhibits. It was an exhilarating blend of uncovering and imagining, reconstruction and narrative. Every room in the bunker became a potential historical vignette, every object a thread woven into a much larger tapestry. But bringing such an ambitious idea to life required engaging the world above ground, and the moment Miriam began to reach beyond the safety of the bunker's walls, resistance revealed itself like a shifting tide. Her first stop was the town's administrative office. She met with a clerk who shuffled gum in his mouth while listening to her polite explanation. He raised his eyebrows at the word bunker, scribbled notes without much interest, and asked for a stack of forms. She dutifully filled them out, describing the structure as a historical site requiring formal evaluation. Days later, she received a short, curt email requesting further documentation. Weeks later, she found that her original paperwork had somehow been misplaced. When she went back to the office, the same clerk now had trouble remembering their previous conversation. The delays were subtle enough to seem bureaucratic, but persistent enough to feel intentional. It was as though the process was being slowed by some invisible hand, not outright stopped, but hindered just enough to frustrate her. She tried not to jump to conclusions, but the pattern bothered her. Henry noticed it too, though he offered no theories beyond muttering that governments didn't like surprises. And this bunker, by all measures, was a colossal surprise. Despite the administrative dead ends, Miriam decided not to stop. If anything, the pushback only fueled her determination. She continued preparing the bunker as carefully as if visitors were already due to arrive. She dusted displays, arranged equipment, and cleaned the sleeping quarters, restoring the beds to a semblance of their former order. She cataloged everything meticulously. Notebooks, medical supplies, charts, utensils, clothing still folded in storage lockers. The bunker began to look alive again. Quiet, somber, but undeniably full of presence. Once the bunker's main sections were cleaned and reinforced, she invited a small group of neighbors and town residents to visit. There were only a handful of them. Henry's friends, a retired history teacher, a middle-aged couple who had heard vague rumors about her underground rooms, and a young journalist from the local paper. Miriam guided them through the rooms, her voice trembling at first but gaining strength as she spoke about the soldiers who had lived here, the maps that marked wartime vigilance, the equipment that had been brand new when it was installed. Her visitors reacted with awe, curiosity, and reverence. Even the journalist, who had arrived with skepticism written across his face, seemed humbled. He asked questions, took careful notes, and later published an article titled, "A Forgotten Waututh Treasure Beneath Our Town." It was a modest piece, but it struck a chord. Within a week, more residents expressed interest, asking quietly if Miriam would be opening the bunker regularly. Word spread, and soon the idea of a museum no longer belonged solely to Miriam. It had become part of the town's collective imagination. Yet, not all reactions were welcoming. The first anonymous message came in the form of a typed letter slipped under her front door. It contained only a single line: "You don't know what you're dealing with." There was no name, no explanation, no threat beyond its ominous implication. Miriam stared at it for a long time, her heart pounding as memories of past intimidation flickered through her mind. She had thought she left that life behind when she divorced her husband. But this was different. This was not personal. This was about something that lived below her home, something someone didn't want to be disturbed. The second message appeared 2 days later. It was attached to her mailbox with tape and read, "Stop before it's too late." The words tightened a cold band around her spine. She showed Henry, who studied both notes with troubled eyes. He suggested calling the police, but Miriam hesitated. What would she say? That she wanted help because someone didn't want her to open a bunker museum. She feared the officers might dismiss her concerns, or worse, become curious enough to attract more attention to the site. Then came the nights when she heard soft, crunching gravel near her fence, the faint murmur of a car engine left running in the dark, the sense of being watched from somewhere she couldn't pinpoint. Each time she stepped outside, the street was empty, calm, and quiet. But the unease remained. The unease turned to dread when she discovered that some of the documents she had meticulously arranged on a table in the communications room were missing. At first, she thought she had misplaced them. Then she convinced herself she must have carried them upstairs and forgotten. But a deeper search revealed the truth. Someone had been inside the bunker in her absence. There were no signs of forced entry on the hatch. Her home's doors and windows were intact, yet the papers had vanished. Not randomly. Specific documents containing map annotations and coded messages had been removed with precision. Someone knew what they were looking for. Someone understood the significance of the documents perhaps even better than she did. She tried to steady herself, telling Henry what she'd discovered. He insisted on inspecting the rooms again, examining the corners for fresh footprints or disturbed dust. It didn't take him long to find subtle signs: a faint scuff on a concrete edge, a barely perceptible shift in a storage crate, a section of dust that looked lighter than it should have been. Someone had walked there recently. Fear clawed its way through Miriam's ribs, though she refused to show it outwardly. Henry offered to stay with her some evenings, but she declined, not wanting to burden him. Instead, she changed the locks on her doors, reevaluated every entrance to the bunker, and began sleeping with her phone on the pillow beside her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the intruder, whoever they were, had not come for financial gain. This was someone looking for something specific, something with historical or personal value. She realized bitterly that the bunker had become both a treasure and a target. Her dream of a museum, once filled with excitement, now tangled with menace. Yet she couldn't bring herself to abandon it. The pull to reveal the truth was too strong. In her growing desperation, she searched the bunker for clues she might have missed and discovered a narrow section of wall near the communications room that seemed slightly misaligned. The seam between two concrete panels looked too sharp. When she pressed it, she felt a slight give. Calling Henry, she pointed out the irregularity. It took them hours to pry the panel aside, but when they finally succeeded, Miriam felt the air leave her lungs. Behind the wall was a cramped hidden chamber, barely large enough for a person to stand. Inside it were remnants of tools, a flashlight that had long run out of battery, and a small notebook so dusty she nearly missed it. It contained names, diagrams, and rough sketches made by someone in the past decades. More importantly, it mapped out routes of the bunker with markings showing secret entrances and exits. This room had been used by someone who had explored the bunker secretly long after the war. Someone who had wanted their presence hidden. Miriam knew with increasing certainty that the person who had taken the documents could be connected to this hidden chamber, someone who knew the bunker intimately, perhaps someone who had helped bury it in the first place. The realization chilled her, but also gave her a sense of direction. Still, fear followed her with every step she took. Even as she worked tirelessly to prepare the bunker for public viewing, ensuring visitors would understand the importance of what had been forgotten, she became more aware of how fragile her newfound purpose was. She sensed that she was moving along a narrow ledge between discovery and danger. Yet she continued. The town's interest grew. People thanked her for preserving something so meaningful. Local schools asked if she could eventually offer tours for students. The journalist came back to interview her again, and this time his questions reflected genuine admiration and curiosity. For a time, it seemed as though the goodwill of the community might outweigh the shadows clinging to the bunker's past. But that hope shattered the morning she arrived to find that several display items had vanished. Documents, a radio component, and a valuable map, gone. She sank to her knees on the cold, concrete floor, overwhelmed with the weight of it. Someone had violated the bunker again. Someone had made it clear that her work was not merely inconvenient to them, it was a threat. She contacted Henry immediately. Together they walked through every room, noting each missing item, searching for signs of forced entry, finding none. The thief moved with experience. They understood the structure, the history, and perhaps even the secrets she had not yet unearthed. Miriam stood in the dim light of the bunker, her breath trembling in her chest, and realized that opening the museum had attracted more than curious locals. It had stirred something silent and watchful, something that had been buried with the bunker itself. As she gazed at the empty spaces where once treasured artifacts had rested, she understood that the past she sought to reveal did not want to be exposed. But turning back was no longer an option. She had already stepped too deep into the story, and now, whether or not she felt ready, she had to confront whatever force, human or historical, wanted her to stop. The only question that lingered, tightening around her heart like a vice, was whether she would be strong enough to face what was coming next. The morning after the theft left Miriam contemplating the empty spaces on the display tables. She stood alone in the bunker, its silence pressing against her ribs like a weight she could hardly bear. The room was cold, but the chill that seeped into her body came from something deeper than temperature. It was the unmistakable feeling of being violated, not just personally, but historically. As if the very past she was trying to preserve had been torn apart in front of her. She sank onto a chair and pressed her trembling hand to her forehead. She had known that her project carried risks, but she had not imagined this, a theft so deliberate, so precise, as if the thief understood the importance of what they stole far more intimately than she did. This was not a random break-in. It was a message. Yet, even as fear gnawed at her conscience, something firmer rose beneath it. A resilience shaped by years of surviving far worse things than shadows in the night. She had endured the cruelty of a man who had tried to strip her of dignity, the grinding poverty that had threatened to bury her dreams, the loneliness of rebuilding when everything had fallen apart. Compared to that, a thief, no matter how calculated, was nothing more than another obstacle. She had not run then, and she would not run now. but she also knew she could not face this alone. Henry arrived shortly after she called him, his expression tight with worry and an anger she had rarely seen in him. He moved slowly through the rooms, examining the missing displays, touching areas of dust that had been disturbed, studying the faint signs of intrusion like a detective solving a puzzle. He muttered things under his breath while Miriam followed him from room to room, her chest tightening each time he pointed out another clue she had missed. The most unsettling thing was the precision of the theft. The missing objects were not random war relics. They were valuable but obscure. They were pieces that connected to larger documents, maps, coded messages, equipment used for communication across secret channels. Miriam had sensed their significance, but seeing them gone made that significance undeniable. Someone knew exactly what mattered most. When they finished their initial inspection, Henry turned to her with a determination that steadied her nerves. He suggested installing cameras, alarms, and even a simple alert system triggered by thread-thin wires that would reveal movement in the dark. The bunker had too many angles, passages, and blind spots to secure it entirely, but they could at least take steps to expose the intruder if he returned. So, for the next several days, they transformed the bunker into a quiet labyrinth of traps and watchers. Henry rigged cameras in the corners, their lenses blinking faintly like electronic eyes. They set up motion sensors near the tunnels and placed small markers on the floor, tiny bits of chalk or dust so faint they were nearly invisible unless disturbed. They hid simple tripwires tied to bells behind crates, and stacked certain objects carefully so that even the slightest shift would reveal tampering. It felt strange to build such things in a place dedicated to watching an enemy long gone, but Miriam understood that her enemy was here now, living in the present, wrapped in shadows and motives she still did not comprehend. She had expected the bunker to provide answers, but instead it continued to generate questions. The theft raised the stakes. Yet one thing grew clearer to her. The thief was not destroying items nor vandalizing the structure. They were taking, not ruining. This was about possession. So she resolved not to close the museum but to reopen it even more boldly, even more publicly. She believed that hiding the bunker now would give her opponent exactly what they wanted: darkness. But by opening it to the world, she might also force the shadows into the light. When Henry questioned her decision, she explained in a steady voice that she would rather confront danger openly than let it fester in secrecy. To her surprise, Henry agreed. He said that fear had already crept too far into the project. Better to stand tall and continue than let the bunker become a tomb of fear. To give the illusion of normalcy, she announced the museum's reopening, posting a simple flyer in town and mentioning it at the local cafe. She invited visitors as if nothing was wrong, as though she had not found threatening notes or witnessed silent prowlers near her property. In truth, she hoped the thief would return, emboldened by her supposed ignorance. She hoped the traps would catch something. Even if she could not catch the person themselves, perhaps she could catch a clue. The day of the reopening came quietly, marked by a gentle fog rolling off the ocean that gave the town an ethereal feel. The bunker smelled faintly of dust and oil, its shadows softened by the lanterns Henry had arranged. Miriam stood at the entrance, composed but alert, ready to greet each curious visitor. People came in a steady stream. Some she had seen before, others new faces. They admired the radios, whispered over the bunks, marveled at the preserved observation instruments. Children pointed at the strange devices, tugging at their parents' hands with innocent enthusiasm. Elderly residents muttered about the past, trying to recall rumors their own parents had once shared. The town was beginning to embrace the bunker not as a curiosity, but as a piece of itself. The act of sharing the bunker filled Miriam with a kind of pride she had not expected. It felt like she was giving something meaningful not only to others, but to herself, a validation of every difficult choice she had made. It gave her back a sense of agency that had been eroded through years of struggle. For a few brief moments, she forgot the shadow hanging over the place. But the next morning, that illusion abruptly broke. Henry arrived early, as he often did, his boots echoing through the bunker as he checked the traps. Miriam followed behind him, tension tightening her neck. One by one, they inspected the tripwires. Several had shifted. A small bell lay on the floor. Footprints, faint but undeniably fresh, traced across a thin layer of dust. Their cameras captured only fragments, the edge of a sleeve, a silhouette in the dark, a figure moving with calculated stealth, but never fully visible. They had almost caught him. Almost. Miriam's breath grew shallow as she examined the prints. Whoever the intruder was, they were moving deeper into the bunker, toward areas she had not yet fully explored. This meant the thief knew routes that were not part of the main museum paths, routes only someone familiar with the bunker's buried sections could navigate. She could not escape the conclusion. The intruder was someone who had walked these tunnels long before she bought the house. She felt an icy clarity form behind her ribs. The thief had been here before the museum existed, before she had found the hatch. Perhaps even before the previous owners sold her the house. That meant he had a history with the bunker, and perhaps knowledge she did not yet possess. Unable to remain passive, Miriam resolved to take a more active role that night. She and Henry agreed to stay in the bunker after closing, hidden in separate rooms with walkie-talkies. They removed the camera's indicator lights to hide their presence. They turned off the lanterns in the side corridors to deepen the shadows. It was a dangerous plan, but Miriam felt she was past the point where caution alone could protect her. She needed truth. Hours passed slowly as darkness thickened. The air grew colder and heavier, pressing down like the weight of history itself. Miriam sat behind a stacked shelf in one of the storage rooms, her flashlight dimmed, her body stiff with alertness. Every sound echoed like a warning: the hum of the small generator, the distant drip of water from a pipe she hadn't noticed before. Near midnight, a faint scrape reached her ears. Then another. A soft shuffle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She held her breath, gripping the walkie-talkie until her knuckles whitened. Through the dimness, she saw a shadow shift, then a figure emerging from a side corridor like a ghost climbing out of the past. She whispered into the walkie-talkie, her voice barely audible. Henry responded with a tense acknowledgement. The intruder moved with expert precision, avoiding the main lights, stepping only where the dust was disturbed from earlier visits. Miriam watched him silently as he kneeled by a display case and slid something into his pocket. That was enough. She rose from her hiding place with trembling but resolute legs, stepping forward and letting her flashlight beam fall across him. At that moment, Henry appeared from the opposite side, blocking the exit with his bulk. The man froze, shielding his face instinctively from the light. For a long moment, no one spoke. The bunker's walls compressed the silence into something almost tangible. When the flashlight lowered slightly and the man's face was revealed, Miriam felt a jolt, not of fear, but of stunned recognition. It was Adam, one of Henry's former workers. a man who had helped dig out sections of the bunker, a man who had walked with them through the corridors months ago when the excavations began, a man who had smiled and nodded and listened quietly as the history of the bunker unfolded. Adam's shoulders sagged as if years of tiredness had suddenly fallen onto him. He did not run. He did not fight. He simply stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with a mixture of guilt and shame. Miriam stepped closer, drawn by a need to understand, and Adam lowered his gaze to the floor. He trembled, not with fear of capture, but with something resembling despair. Words spilled from him in fragments, confessions woven with apologies. He explained, with a voice barely above a whisper, that he had fallen into crushing debt after losing work, that he had been approached by collectors willing to pay enormous sums for artifacts from forgotten wartime structures, that he had been tempted beyond his capacity to resist. He admitted that when they first uncovered the bunker, he had recognized its potential value. He had returned at night using old entry shafts he knew from construction work, shafts Miriam had not yet discovered. He told them that at first he had taken nothing important, only small items to test whether anyone noticed. But as the museum plans grew, as the town took interest, as articles were published, the collectors pressured him relentlessly. They wanted specific items, documents, equipment, maps that held clues to classified operations. He had not intended to hurt her, he said. He had not expected the bunker to become her life's purpose. Miriam felt her hands shaken as she listened. Anger warred with pity, with understanding, with disbelief. The man had betrayed her trust, stolen history, endangered her project. But he was not a cruel man. He was desperate, and desperation had filled much of her own life for years. She recognized its trembling edges. Henry's fury simmered visibly beneath his calm exterior, but Miriam sensed that calling the police would solve nothing. It would end Adam's life in an irreversible way and likely bring attention to the bunker that she was not prepared to handle. Authorities could seize the property, shut down the museum, bury everything again, not out of malice, but bureaucracy. She found herself speaking softly, asking Adam whether he could return what he had taken. His eyes filled with relief and disbelief. He nodded vigorously, promising to recover everything still in his possession, and to lead her to the places where he had hidden the rest. Over the next few days, Adam guided them to a shed behind an abandoned property, a storage locker miles away, and a shallow pit near the old docks. One by one, the missing items were recovered, miraculously intact. Some had been wrapped carefully to prevent damage, revealing that Adam, for all his errors, had never intended to destroy history, only to survive financially. With the artifacts returned, Miriam focused on rebuilding trust, both with herself and with the bunker's legacy. Adam, confronted with the gravity of what he had done, offered his help in repairing damage and reinforcing weak points. Surprisingly, Miriam accepted. His knowledge of the bunker, of its corridors and hidden entrances, was too valuable to discard, and she sensed that allowing him to make amends would bring closure more effectively than punishment ever could. Together with Henry, they installed stronger security, sealed dangerous entry points, and added high-quality surveillance. What had begun as a fragile dream became a fortified reality. The museum emerged stronger, safer, and more complete than before. When Miriam finally stood before the crowd at the grand reopening ceremony the bunker illuminated and polished, she felt something inside her settle. Visitors arrived in droves, walking through the chambers with reverence, marveling at the preserved history. Local officials delivered speeches praising her dedication to preserving the town's heritage. Families wandered through the observation tower. Children gazed in wonder at the old machinery. Journalists scribbled notes. Photographs were taken. Stories were shared. And for the first time in years, Miriam felt whole. When the ceremony ended and the last visitor left, she lingered in the quiet bunker, walking through the corridors alone. The air was still, the lights warm, the shadows no longer menacing. She touched the cold metal of the observation scope, feeling not the fear of the unknown, but the steady, measured breath of history resting in safe hands. She had walked into darkness and emerged not only unbroken, but stronger. The truth beneath her home had nearly consumed her, but she had brought it into the light. And now it belonged not only to her, but to everyone who would walk these corridors and learn its story. As she ascended the ladder toward her home, the bunker's silence followed her. But it was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of peace, of a story finally given a voice, of the past and present learning to coexist. And as she stepped back into the light of her home, she knew that her life, once defined by struggle and loss, had found new meaning beneath the ground she walked on. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a guardian of truth. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Share this video with someone who loves real mysteries, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps this channel grow,